Lecture 67, Charles Dickens.
What I wanted, who can say? How could I say when I never knew? What I dreaded was that in some unlucky hour, I, being at my grimiest and commonest, should lift up my eyes and see Estella looking in at one of the wooden windows of the forge. I was haunted by the fear that she would, sooner or later, find me out, with a black face and hands doing the coarsest part of my work, and would exult over me and despise me. The words come from a character named Pip, the protagonist and narrator of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. In November 1860, when the first installment of this novel appeared, Dickens was 48 and already famous for his fiction. Yet even at the height of his fame, Dickens never forgot the sufferings and humiliations of his childhood. Born in Portsmouth in 1812 as the first son of a naval clerk, he went to school in Chatham, and then in London as his father was transferred from one naval office to another. But at the age of 12, when his father was jailed for debt at the Marshalsea prison, he had to leave school and go to work in a shoeblacking factory, putting labels on bottles. The work itself and the rough gang of boys he had to work with filled his soul with what he called secret agony. And the memory of that agony must have led him to conceive the misery of little Pip, a boy with vague but grand ambitions, yearning to be loved by a beautiful young girl named Estella. But even while yearning to be loved, he fears that she will only despise and ridicule him because of the grime that covers him and marks him as a common laborer, a mere apprentice to a blacksmith. Dickens' early struggles to make his way in the world remind us a little of Jane Austen, who had to live on a tight budget after her father died. But by then, she was a grown woman of 29 and had already drafted 2 of the novels that would later make her name. Dickens had to support himself before he was out of his teens. Though he went back to school in May of 1824, shortly after his father was released from prison, he didn't stay long. In 3 years, the family's debts forced him to quit school for good and go to work, first as a solicitor's clerk, and then, after learning shorthand, as a reporter of debates at the House of Commons. In his spare time, he read every day at the British Museum. So Dickens had to struggle much harder than Jane Austen to learn what he needed to know. If Austen was largely homeschooled, Dickens was largely self-schooled. Yet, like Jane Austen, he began to write when he was scarcely more than a child. At the age of 10, he wrote his first tragedy, and for a time he hoped to become an actor. At 21, his first story appeared in all the glory of print, and from then on, Dickens became an engine of words. After placing more than 40 sketches and tales in various London magazines, he published his first book, Sketches by Boz, just as he turned 24. A month later, he started writing the book that truly launched his fame, Pickwick Papers. Pickwick Papers was published as Dickens wrote it, in 20 monthly installments that normally sold for $1 each. Dickens learned early on how to create plots and characters that made his readers hungry for more, as they gobbled up each morsel he fed them. So he went on to publish each of his novels in cheap serial form before it appeared as a whole, and thus sustained his great popularity. His popularity sprang from his treatment of people and places quite different from the rural gentry of Jane Austen. Dickens wrote about various parts of the world, including France and America, as well as his native England. But the center of his fictional universe was the city of London, and his cast of characters included figures from virtually every station in life. In particular, his novels featured children raised in poverty and hardship, or rather children like the child that he himself once was, tantalizingly exposed to education and the advantages of gentility, but forced to struggle for them, growing up in a world where the barriers between one social class and another could be surmounted only by great effort, great luck, or both. Dickens' London is the product of the Industrial Revolution, a heterogeneous city of factories, overcrowded slums, and elegant mansions, and also the capital of the nascent British Empire. Near the end of Great Expectations, Pip goes to work in Egypt as the agent of a British trading company. By the end of the 19th century, a vast army of agents such as this, along with an even vaster army of soldiers, would secure Britain's dominance in much of the world. In the meantime, Dickens spotlighted the cruel disparities of life at home. In the mid-19th century, when manufacturing and worldwide trade were making many Englishmen rich, he forced his readers to experience vicariously the lives of the poor, and especially the trials, frustrations, and burning hopes of children born into poverty. No character created by Dickens exemplifies this condition more than Pip, the hero of Great Expectations. But Pip is not just the hero of Great Expectations. He is its narrator, a grown man telling the story of his whole life from childhood on. So Great Expectations has the shape of autobiography. Because it begins with the narrator's earliest memories, it may remind us of another autobiography, Wordsworth's Prelude, first completed in 1805, but not published until 1850, just 10 years before the first installment of Great Expectations appeared. Dickens' novel seems Wordsworthian from the start. It begins in the marshlands of Kent, where Dickens spent 3 of his childhood years, and the first third of the novel takes us from about 1810 to 1830, just the period in which Dickens grew up. But even though he used material from his own life to write Great Expectations, this is not autobiography. It's fiction made by an artist who knew by the mid-19th century that he was up against formidable competition. For this was the great age of English fiction, a period in which English novelists were achieving new kinds of complexity, new heights of brilliance, new depths of revelation. In 1847, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights both appeared. And in the same year, William Makepeace Thackeray made his name with a fictional panorama of London society called Vanity Fair. In 1859, just a year before Dickens started work on Great Expectations, George Eliot struck gold with her first novel, Adam Bede, and followed it up just 1 year later with The Mill on the Floss. This was no time for Dickens to bask in the bright, warm sun of his fame. He had to challenge himself, extend himself, test the powers of his art. So he chose to do 2 things with the structure of the novel. First, he created a character who would tell his own story completely in his own voice, a first-person narrator. This was hardly unprecedented, for Dickens himself had already used a first-person narrator in David Copperfield. But in Great Expectations, the first-person narrator makes a startling discovery. He has monumentally deceived himself about his own expectations. Just think about the technical challenge this presents. In most of the novels published up to this time, the story is told by an unnamed, omniscient narrator, by an unseen observer who knows everything. In Pride and Prejudice, this omniscient narrator describes many things from the viewpoint of Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine. But from the start, the narrator knows much more than Elizabeth does, and thus can show us certain things about Darcy and Wickham that Elizabeth fails to see, until she's shocked out of her blindness and prejudice by Darcy's long letter. But how can a story told by a single narrator about himself be made to reveal the blindness of that narrator, be made to show how inconsiderately he has treated those who nurtured and supported him, how self-destructively he has loved and trusted those who tortured him for their own amusement, and how miserably he has misled himself? The answer to this question is the achievement of Great Expectations. Great Expectations is first of all a novel about Pip's quest for identity, a sense of himself. Orphaned in infancy, Pip never knew either his father or mother. His parents have left him nothing but the name of Philip Pirrip, which he could not pronounce and therefore shortened to Pip. In the opening paragraphs of the novel, where little Pip tries to imagine what his parents looked like by studying their tombstones, he vividly defines what he calls the identity of things, of the bleak churchyard, of the marshes around it, of the river and sea beyond it. He situates himself in geographical space. He recites the names on the tombstones. but he has no real grasp of the identities that stand behind those names. Furthermore, his own identity, the identity of the self that occupies the perceptual center of this world, his own identity is a bundle of shivers. Pure cold, pure misery, pure fear. He cannot visualize himself. He can only describe himself as the victim of painful sensations. Pip's early life is a bundle of such sensations. He's turned upside down by Magwitch, the frightening brute with a leg iron who seizes him in the churchyard. Others treat him no better. Uncle Pumblechook regularly rumples his hair. The cold and beautiful Estella, whom he meets at the house of Miss Havisham, slaps his face as hard as she can. The pale young gentleman that he meets outside the house one day decides for no reason at all to start a fight by pulling Pip's hair and butting his stomach. And his sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, raises him by hand with the help of something called a tickler, a wax-ended piece of cane, writes Pip, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. This steady stream of physical abuse is swollen by various kinds of verbal abuse. On Christmas Day in the Gargery household, there are no presents for Pip. What he gets instead are moral goads, repeated reminders of just how bad he is. Mr. Hubble observes that boys are never grateful because they are naturally vicious, born bad. Pip has already been called Little Devil, and Estella will later call him a little coarse monster. At the Christmas dinner table, Uncle Pumblechook playfully imagines what would have happened if Pip had been born a pig, a four-footed squeaker, such as they are even now feasting on. Instead of having the exquisite privilege of being raised by hand and enjoying a dinner such as this, Pip is reminded that he could have attended such a dinner only as the main course. Ha, ha, ha. But the joke is not at all funny to a boy whose fat cheeks have already been hungrily eyed by Magwitch, an escaped convict desperate for food. Magwitch tells the boy that unless he brings him food and drink and a file, the boy will have his heart and liver ripped out, roasted, and eaten, all of which the terrified little boy most heartily believes. So, from the very beginning of the novel, Pip is potentially dehumanized, made to feel no better than a piece of meat or an animal. Magwitch calls him a dog, and that's what he's made to feel like at Satis house. This is the grand and gloomy mansion of the withered, bored, and rich Miss Havisham, where Pip is sent to play for her amusement, and where he meets Estella, her adopted daughter. At the end of Pip's first visit to Miss Havisham's house, when Estella brings him bread and meat and a little mug of beer, she hands them over without even looking at him, as insolently, Pip says, as if I were a dog in disgrace. Two things about this experience humiliate him. Since Pip has already seen Magwitch eating just like a dog, he now feels painfully linked to a character that he despises, a man he's been trying desperately to forget. But again and again, the memory of Magwitch will force its way back into Pip's consciousness. He will be haunted by that memory until Magwitch at last returns to stand before him in one of the most extraordinary scenes of the book. But let's consider Pip's relation to Estella, for it is Pip's meeting with Estella that most dramatically affects his sense of identity. Up to his meeting with Estella, the identities thrust upon him are all figurative or fanciful. Devil, dog, squeaker, main course. But the first identity that is thrust upon Pip by Estella is all too founded in fact. The very first thing Estella calls Pip is a common laboring boy. A common laboring boy, she says, with coarse hands and coarse boots. These aren't fanciful or figurative terms. They accurately describe Pip's appearance. On top of that, they are words contemptuously flung at him by the transcendently beautiful Estella, whose very name means star. And that's the way she first appears to Pip. Summoned by Miss Havisham, she suddenly arrives, and her light, says Pip, came along the dark passage like a star. When this cold, star-like Estella looks down on Pip, all she can see is a common laboring boy. That's the identity in which he feels himself hopelessly trapped as he leaves Miss Havisham's house and walks 4 miles back to the grimy blacksmith's forge where he works as an apprentice to his stepfather, Joe Gargery. So, just as soon as he falls in love with Estella, Pip falls into loathing of himself, of his identity as a blacksmith's apprentice. He cannot possibly reconcile that identity with the beauty of Estella. As we've already seen, he's haunted and horrified by the idea that this beautiful, star-like young woman might one day look in through the windows of the grimy forge, that she might find me out with a black face and hands doing the coarsest part of my work and would exult over and despise me. Estella drastically changes Pip's conception of himself. Before meeting her, he respects the life of a blacksmith because he likes Joe Gargery, who works hard and treats him much more kindly than Mrs. Joe does. Before meeting Estella, he says he had believed in the forge as the glowing road to manhood and independence. But repeated visits to Satis House and repeated meetings with Estella have given him a whole new vision of himself and his destiny. Now he yearns to escape from his life as a blacksmith's apprentice, to enter the world of wealth and beauty and power that he finds at Satis House, the house that vaguely promises to satisfy and realize his wildest dreams. Now, see how Pip's new yearning drives the novel. At first, Pip starts his journey up the road to life as a blacksmith, to the worthy of humble life of a good, honest, hard-working man. But overlaying this simple, realistic story of an apprenticeship is something quite different. A fabulous plot, or what Peter Brooks calls a dream plot, the story of how Pip discovers his great expectations. This discovery springs from what Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, calls the family romance. In the family romance, the central figure is a child, typically a boy, who finds himself being raised by simple, ordinary parents, but who imagines that these two ordinary people are just his foster parents, that he is really the child of nobility or even royalty, a prince in disguise. Wild as that may sound, the psychological power of this fantasy is enormous, and it plays a crucial role in driving the plot of Great Expectations. Think of how Pip's situation feeds this fantasy. Pip knows full well that Joe Gargery is his foster father, not his real one. And as soon as Pip learns to read, he feels himself culturally superior to Joe, who can scarcely read at all. Furthermore, Pip feels profoundly alienated from his sister, who comes across looking very much like the wicked stepmother of the fairy tale. So what should Pip think when he's suddenly invited to go and play at the grand house of Miss Havisham and to meet the beautiful Estella? Pumblechook himself has led Mrs. Joe to think that this boy's fortune may be made by his going to Miss Havisham's. This great expectation feeds Pip's secret fantasy so well that nothing can destroy it. When Miss Havisham decides that it's time for Pip to begin his apprenticeship, she summons Joe Gargery, gives him £25 on Pip's behalf, and tells him plainly that is all Pip will ever get from her. And when Pip later pays her a visit, she tells him bluntly, "I hope you want nothing, you'll get nothing." Yet shortly after, when a lawyer named Jaggers turns up with the astounding news that Pip's fortune is going to be made by some mysterious benefactor, what does Pip instantly conclude? My dream was out. My wild fancy was surpassed by sober reality. Miss Havisham was going to make my fortune on a grand scale. Pip here says plainly what he has all along believed, but never dared to say even to himself. He really is a prince in disguise, and his true nobility is at last being recognized and rewarded by Miss Havisham. And because he believes so intensely in this dream, Pip has absolutely no trouble finding evidence to support it. Just before leaving the marsh country for London, where he's to be educated as a gentleman, Pip is given the money to buy a new suit, which is promptly made to order for him. Nothing off the rack for this young gentleman. When he goes to see Miss Havisham to show off his smart new suit and bid her goodbye, she looks to him like a fairy godmother, the fairy godmother who replaced the wicked stepmother, the fairy godmother who has magically changed him at a stroke from a grimy common laborer into a handsomely dressed young gentleman. Just imagine Cinderella as a male, and you come pretty close to Pip here. But unlike Cinderella, Pip doesn't just feel changed, he feels recognized. he feels that he himself has at last discovered his own true nature beneath the grime of a common laborer. When Miss Havisham stretched out her hand to say goodbye, he says, I went down on my knee and put it to my lips. I had not considered how I should take leave of her. It came naturally to me at this moment to do this. It came naturally. Acting purely on instinct, the prince in disguise reveals his true identity. But the identity is not so much revealed as it is forged and hammered out by the sheer will to believe. In the face of blunt warnings to the contrary, Pip firmly believes that Miss Havisham will make his fortune, that Miss Havisham must be the mysterious benefactor whose money will make him a gentleman. And Pip has not only decided that Miss Havisham must be his benefactor, he's also fallen in love with her adopted daughter. So what else must he inevitably conclude? You guessed it, Estella is meant for him. Miss Havisham, his fairy godmother, intends to give him this beautiful young woman as his wife. For every prince must, of course, have his princess. Wealth and beauty. Such a lovely, seductive, irresistible fantasy. What could possibly be wrong with it? Just about everything. Let's remember, first of all, that in order to believe in this enchanting prospect, Pip must ignore the clear and repeated warnings that he should expect nothing more from Miss Havisham than what she has already given him. Second, consider what sort of fairy godmother Miss Havisham is. Many years ago, as an eager young bride, she was jilted by her groom. She's never forgotten the humiliation of her wedding day. So she lives in a great dark house where the blinds are drawn and the clocks all stopped at 20 minutes to 9 when she got the letter that called the wedding off. She still wears the wedding dress, now faded and yellow. She still keeps the wedding cake, now rotten, cobwebbed, and crawling with spiders. And hovering around her from time to time, waiting for her to die, is a little group of relatives, all desperate to inherit her money and fiercely jealous of anyone else who might lay claim to it. But Miss Havisham loves to manipulate and torture the hopes of these greedy relatives, especially one of them, a woman named Sarah Pocket. With that in mind, consider the rest of the paragraph in which Pip describes his leave-taking from Miss Havisham. Just after Pip kneels to kiss her hand, he says, she looked at Sarah Pocket with triumph in her weird eyes, and so I left my fairy godmother with both her hands on her crutch stick, standing in the midst of the dimly lighted room beside the rotten bride cake that was hidden in cobwebs. Pip fails to see what is plain to us. If Miss Havisham takes a malicious delight in frustrating the expectations of Sarah Pocket, why should she not take malicious delight in exciting and then frustrating the expectations of Pip himself? Here she is, a decrepit figure leaning on her crutch, stuck in a museum dedicated to frustrated expectations, perversely perpetuating the moment when she expected the groom who never appeared. Later on, Pip will learn that she has raised Estella as an instrument of her revenge on all the male sex, as a woman trained to excite desire but never gratify it, leaving men rejected and humiliated as Miss Havisham herself was. During Pip's very first visit to Sadie's house, he overhears her tell Estella to break Pip's heart. This, then, is the heartbreaking nightmare lurking beneath the glorious daydream that Pip constructs for himself. There is simply no way of separating the beauty of Estella from the decay and vengefulness personified by Miss Havisham. Different as they are, these two characters, the beautiful young princess and the withered old witch, these two characters exemplify the Dickensian device of the double, wherein one character is doubled or reflected by a second, who seems on the surface quite different, but who nonetheless emerges as the dark shadow of the first. The device of the double is nowhere more powerfully displayed than in Pip's relation to Magwitch, the escaped convict who confronts him in the churchyard. On the surface, these two seem altogether different. What, after all, can this repulsive, brutal, overbearing convict have in common with an innocent, vulnerable little boy? Well, let's consider. When Pip steals a file and some food and brandy for the convict, is he just a terrified little boy, hoping the convict will spare his life? Or is he a thief? Now, most of us would probably say he's not a thief. He's just a scared little kid. Even though he feels guilty of theft, we want to say he's not really guilty at all. He's been made to steal against his will. And if he feels guilty for that, well, that just shows how innocent he really is. But the fact is that he does make a secret compact with a criminal. On behalf of the criminal, he steals things, including a file that the convict will use to get out of his leg iron and thus defy the law. Later on, after the convict is caught, Pip sees a stranger in a tavern stirring his rum and water with a file and significantly cocking his eye at him. The file tells Pip that this stranger knows Magwitch, and the stranger forges another link between Pip and the convict when he offers Pip a shilling wrapped in 2 fat, sweltering 1-pound notes, a considerable sum in Pip's young eyes, especially since at this point he doesn't yet know about his great expectations. Now, the fascinating thing about this scene is that Pip takes the stranger's money, even though it may have come from Magwitch. This is payment for services rendered to a criminal. Pip doesn't want to admit, even to himself, that he has anything to do with criminals, and he's not happy about taking money from what he knows to be a criminal source. But when Jaggers the lawyer turns up with the news of Pip's great expectations, Pip takes a much greater sum of money without having any idea where it comes from. He's forbidden to ask, but he takes it anyway. How can he be sure that his money untainted by crime? He can't, of course, and his willingness to take such money blurs the line in this novel between innocence and guilt, the honesty and crime. Pip not only steals for the convict, he has murderous impulses that he never fully acknowledges, even to himself, but that rise up from his unconscious for us to see. At the end of his first visit to Miss Havisham, he walks into the old brewery standing next to her house and has a hallucination, a vision of Miss Havisham herself in her faded dress, hanging by the neck from a great wooden beam. What does this mean? Pip himself doesn't know, but we can surely hazard a guess. At Satis' house, he finds a princess and a witch. Unconsciously, he wants to kill the witch and take the princess. Just as revealing is Pip's response to the brutal attack on his sister, Mrs. Joe, by someone unknown. The weapon used in the attack, it seems, was the very leg iron that Magwitch removed from his leg with the aid of the file that was stolen for him by Pip. So Pip is almost literally linked to the violent attack on his sister and feels guilty about furnishing the weapon. What he doesn't feel at all is the one thing you would expect anyone to feel at the news of a violent attack on a brother or sister: sorrow. And why doesn't Pip feel sorrow? We know why. We know that Pip hates his sister. We know he must be glad to see her incapacitated, unable to speak a word or use the tickler on him ever again. Whoever he was, the attacker has gratified Pip's deepest wishes, so deep that he has never stated them to himself. He's repressed them, but they are now gratified by a flagrantly criminal act. And they raise again for us the question of just how innocent Pip can be in his quest for wealth and beauty, in his quest for an identity far above and beyond the lowly status that has been thrust upon him by his sister and Joe. Incidents like the attack on Mrs. Joe suggest a plot structure that is not so much logical as psychological, a plot driven by the sheer force of Pip's secret desires. I barely considered here part one of Great Expectations and can merely glance at the rest. What we begin to see in part one is something that Pip will not truly learn until much later, that his dream of rising to wealth and becoming a gentleman and marrying Estella cannot be separated from the nightmare of Miss Havisham's quest for revenge, or from the taint of criminal behavior, from murderous intentions and violent acts. Just in case you haven't yet read the whole of Great Expectations, I won't tell you who Pip's mysterious benefactor turns out to be. But I will tell you that the shock of meeting this benefactor in person shatters Pip's dream altogether and forces him to reconstruct an identity that has up to now been founded on his great expectations of wealth. You will see for yourself just how Pip rebuilds his identity as his dream of possessing Estella collides with the reality of her life and his own.